30,000 feet above the clouds, a red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle hums through the night, dim lights casting shadows over a packed cabin. Jamal Carter, a black inventor cradling his prototype, sits in first class when flight attendant Karen Voss screams he stole his seat, her voice slicing through the silence. 10 minutes later, her boss fires her over the intercom, passengers cheer, but the broadcast cuts off mid-sentence. A man whispers, "This isn't over." What's next for Jamal's life? Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice against prejudice, hit like and subscribe for more gripping tales of triumph. The first-class cabin of the red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle buzzed with the low hum of engines as passengers settled into their plush seats, the air thick with the stale scent of recycled oxygen and overpriced cologne. Jamal Carter, a 35-year-old black inventor with a lean frame and eyes that sparkled with quiet determination, adjusted his position, his fingers brushing the sleek leather of his carry-on bag resting on his lap. Inside that bag lay his life's work, a revolutionary solar battery prototype capable of powering entire neighborhoods with a single charge. A breakthrough he'd spent 7 years perfecting in a cramped garage lit by flickering bulbs. His first-class ticket wasn't a fluke. It was a hard-earned reward, a rare moment of luxury for a man who'd clawed his way up from nothing, his calloused hands proof of countless nights soldering circuits until dawn. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, 30,000 feet above a sleeping world, and Jamal allowed himself a small smile, the kind that comes from knowing you've beaten the odds stacked against you since birth. Around him, passengers sipped complimentary champagne or scrolled through tablets, their faces bathed in the soft glow of screens, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few rows ahead. A woman in a tailored blazer flipped through a fashion magazine, her manicured nails tapping the pages, while a gray-haired man in a pinstripe suit snored softly, his head lolling against the window. The atmosphere felt calm, almost serene, a bubble of privilege floating high above the chaos of the ground below. Then she appeared. Karen Voss, the flight attendant, a wiry blonde with a pinched face and a permanent scowl etched into her thin lips, her uniform crisp but her demeanor anything but welcoming. She moved through the aisle with the efficiency of a drill sergeant, her heels clicking against the carpeted floor, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger like a hawk sizing up prey. When her gaze landed on Jamal, it stuck, lingering far, too long, her pale blue irises narrowing into slits as if she'd spotted something out of place in her perfectly ordered domain. He didn't notice at first, too focused on unzipping his bag to pull out a worn notebook filled with equations and sketches, his mind already racing ahead to the investor meeting in Seattle that could turn his prototype into a global game-changer. Karen stopped abruptly at his row, her shadow falling over him, blocking the overhead light and casting his face into a pool of darkness. Her voice cut through the hum of the cabin, sharp and deliberate, each word laced with an undertone of venom that made the hairs on Jamal's neck prickle. "Excuse me, sir, can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone slow and patronizing, as if she were speaking to someone who couldn't possibly understand the concept of assigned seating. Jamal looked up, startled, his brow furrowing slightly, but he kept his composure, years of navigating subtle slights having taught him to stay cool under pressure. "Sure," he said evenly, reaching into the pocket of his faded denim jacket, his movements calm and deliberate, pulling out the neatly folded ticket he'd triple-checked at the gate just to avoid moments like this. He handed it over, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and she snatched it with a flick of her wrist, her lips pursing as she unfolded it with exaggerated care, holding it up to the light like a detective inspecting a forged document. The passengers nearby shifted in their seats, sensing the shift in the air, their eyes flicking toward the scene with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The woman with the magazine paused mid-page, her nails hovering over a glossy ad, while the snoring man stirred, blinking awake as if jolted by an invisible alarm. Karen scanned the pass, her head tilting slightly, her scowl deepening as she confirmed what she didn't want to believe, that Jamal Carter, seat 3A, belonged exactly where he sat. She handed it back, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper for a split second too long, her mouth opening as if to say something more, but then she snapped it shut, her jaw tightening. "People like you don't belong up here," she muttered, the words slipping out just loud enough for Jamal and the woman in the blazer to hear. A venomous jab disguised as a throwaway comment. The woman gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. But Jamal didn't flinch, his face a mask of calm, though his grip on the notebook tightened, his knuckles whitening against the spiral binding. He'd heard worse, far worse, from teachers, who'd told him he'd never amount to anything, from bosses who'd passed him over for promotions despite his brilliance, from strangers who'd crossed the street when he walked by at night. This was just another jab, he told himself. Another mosquito bite in a lifetime of stings, and he could swat it away by staying focused, by proving them wrong with his work. Karen turned on her heel, her blonde ponytail swinging like a pendulum, and marched back toward the galley, her steps sharp and purposeful, her scowl now a full-blown grimace. The woman in the blazer leaned toward her seatmate, a lanky guy with wire-rimmed glasses, and whispered, "Did she really just say that?" The guy nodded, his brow creasing, but neither spoke up, their silence a heavy weight that settled over the row. Jamal exhaled slowly, his breath steadying as he opened his notebook, flipping to a page covered in precise diagrams, his pencil hovering over a half-finished calculation. He told himself it was over, that Karen's little power play had fizzled out, that he could get back to what mattered, the meeting, the prototype, the future he'd built with his own hands. The cabin settled back into its rhythm, the hum of the engines blending with the rustle of pages and the clink of glassware, a fragile peace restored. But Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that prickled at the base of his spine, a quiet instinct honed by years of being the odd man out. The sense that this wasn't the end, that Karen's muttered words were just the opening salvo in a battle he hadn't signed up for. He glanced at his bag, the prototype nestled safely inside, and told himself he was being paranoid, that a flight attendant's petty grudge couldn't derail a dream this big. The plane soared on, cutting through the night sky, its passengers, blissfully unaware that the tension simmering in row 3 was about to ignite into something far uglier, something that would test Jamal's resilience in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Karen disappeared behind the galley curtain, her silhouette vanishing into the shadows, but her presence lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, dark and ominous, promising chaos yet to come. Jamal traced a line on his sketch, his pencil, steady, his mind forcing itself back to the numbers, to the science, to the one thing he could control. He thought he'd weathered the worst of it, that staying calm had been enough to shut her down. He was wrong. The red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle sliced through the night sky, its engines a steady growl beneath the dimmed cabin lights that flickered like tired stars, casting jagged shadows across the first-class seats where passengers huddled, in a restless half-sleep. Jamal Carter sat rigid in row 3, his lean frame pressed against the cool leather, his dark eyes locked on the notebook in his lap, its pages a chaotic tapestry of pencil strokes and equations that mapped out his solar battery prototype, a device that could light up entire cities with a whisper of sunlight. The air felt heavier now, thicker with the recycled staleness of 30,000 feet, and the faint turbulence jostled the plane, sending a ripple of unease through the cabin as tray tables rattled and overhead bins creaked. Around him, the privileged few of first class stirred, the woman in the blazer sipping a gin and tonic, her glass clinking against the armrest, while the gray-haired man rubbed his eyes, peering out at the endless black beyond the window. Jamal's fingers brushed the zipper of his carry-on, the bag that held his future, its worn fabric a silent testament to years of sacrifice, and he tried to sink back into his work, to drown out the sting of Karen Voss's earlier words. Those venomous mutters about people like him not belonging. He'd brushed it off, or so he thought, chalking it up to petty ignorance, but the quiet hadn't lasted long. The curtain to the galley parted with a sharp swish, and there she was again, Karen, her wiry frame stalking back down the aisle, her blonde ponytail bouncing with each clipped step, her scowl now a jagged slash across her face, her pale hands clutching a clipboard as if it were a weapon. She stopped dead at Jamal's row, her shadow swallowing the faint glow of his reading light, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the engine suddenly deafening in the stillness. "Sir," she snapped, her voice a blade wrapped in false politeness, "I need to check your bag for security reasons." Jamal's head jerked up, his brow creasing, his heart thudding against his ribs as he processed the absurdity of it. his calm facade cracking just enough for a flicker of confusion to slip through. "My bag?" he echoed, his tone steady but edged with a question, his hands instinctively tightening around the carry-on. "Why? I went through all the checks at the gate." Karen's lips curled into a sneer, her eyes glinting with something dark, something personal, as she leaned in closer, her breath sour with coffee and spite. "It's just protocol," she said, her smile tight and brittle, a lie so thin it barely held together. "Nothing to worry about." The passengers nearby shifted, their unease palpable. The woman with the gin setting her glass down with a soft clink, her eyes narrowing as she watched, while the gray-haired man muttered something under his breath, his fingers tapping the window frame. What was this woman playing at? Could she really think no one saw through her? Jamal hesitated, his mind racing, weighing his options, knowing that arguing might escalate things, knowing that compliance might embolden her. But before he could decide, Karen lunged forward, snatching the bag from his lap with a yank that sent his notebook tumbling to the floor. He lunged to grab it, but she was already unzipping the bag, her hands diving in like a scavenger tearing into carrion, pulling out his sketches, his tools, his prototype, tossing them onto the tray table with reckless abandon. "What's this? Junk?" she scoffed, holding up a delicate circuit board, her fingers pinching it like it was trash, and then, with a flick of her wrist, she accidentally snapped it in half, the crack echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. Jamal's breath caught, his chest tightening, his voice rising despite himself. "That's $1 million invention," he protested, his calm shattering into shards of frustration, his hands reaching for the broken piece as passengers gasped, their whispers swelling into a low buzz. "Sure it is," Karen laughed, a harsh barking sound that grated against the air, her eyes gleaming with triumph as she dumped the rest of his belongings into a chaotic pile, wires tangling with papers, a wrench clattering against the tray. The woman in the blazer stood halfway up, her voice sharp. "Hey, that's enough, you can't just break his stuff." But Karen wheeled on her, her face flushing red. "Mind your business, lady," she spat, her clipboard slamming against her thigh, her authority a flimsy shield for her venom. The turbulence hit harder, the plane lurching, and Jamal's broken circuit slid off the table, landing at his feet. With a dull thud, a piece of his dream now littering the floor, he knelt to pick it up, his fingers trembling, his mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, that a flight attendant couldn't have this much power to ruin him. Karen stepped back, folding her arms, her sneer widening as she watched him scramble, her victory etched into every line of her face. "All clear," she said curtly, turning to stalk away, leaving Jamal surrounded by the wreckage of his bag, his prototype in pieces, his dignity frayed. The gray-haired man leaned forward, his voice low. "That was uncalled for, son. You okay?" Jamal nodded, forcing a tight smile, his hands carefully gathering the scattered sketches, the tools, the shattered circuit, his composure a thin thread holding him together. He told himself he'd handled it, that staying calm had kept it from getting worse, that he could fix the prototype before Seattle, that this was just a bump in the road. But as Karen vanished behind the galley curtain, her clipboard swinging like a guillotine, he couldn't shake the chill creeping up his spine, the certainty that she wasn't done, that she'd already called for backup on her radio, her voice crackling with intent he couldn't yet hear. The cabin lights flickered again, the turbulence steadied, and the passengers settled back into their seats, their whispers fading. But the air around Jamal crackled with something new, something dangerous. He tucked the broken circuit into his bag, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a quiet fury he hadn't felt in years. Hey viewers, what do you think? Comment number 1 if you agree Karen's way out of line here, or number 2 if you think Jamal should have fought back harder. Ever dealt with someone abusing power like this? Drop your stories below, hit that like button if you're rooting for Jamal to turn this around, and subscribe so you don't miss how he battles back against this madness. Can you believe she broke his invention? Was this just petty spite? Or something bigger brewing? What's Karen planning with that radio call? Stick around to find out. The galley area of the red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle pulsed with a tense electric hum as the plane sliced through the night sky, its engines rumbling beneath the thin carpeted floor where shadows danced under flickering overhead lights. Jamal Carter stood near his seat in first class, his lean frame taut with a mix of anger and restraint, his dark eyes fixed on the scattered wreckage of his solar battery prototype, its broken circuits and crumpled sketches a jagged wound on. The tray table in front of him. The air at 30,000 feet felt suffocating now, thick with the metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the sour aftertaste of Karen Voss's coffee breath lingering from her last assault. Her sneering face still burned into his memory as she'd vanished behind the galley curtain moments ago, her radio crackling with a call he couldn't quite decipher. Around him, the cabin buzzed with uneasy murmurs, the woman in the blazer clutching her empty gin glass, her knuckles white against the crystal, while the gray-haired man squinted toward the commotion, his brow furrowed as if piecing together a puzzle he didn't want to solve. The turbulence had eased, leaving only the steady drone of the engines and the occasional clink of ice in a passenger's drink. But the calm was a lie, a thin veneer stretched tight over a brewing storm. Jamal bent to retrieve a stray wire from the floor, his fingers brushing the cold metal, his mind racing to salvage what he could before his investor meeting in Seattle, when the curtain swished open again and Karen stormed back, her wiry frame vibrating with a fresh wave of malice, her blonde ponytail swinging like a whip as she planted herself in the aisle. Her pale eyes locked onto him, glinting with a venom that made his stomach twist, and she pointed a bony finger at the broken circuit in his hand, her voice rising sharp and shrill above the cabin's hum. "That's contraband," she barked, her words slicing through the air like a blade, her lips curling into a triumphant smirk as she turned to address the galley, her clipboard slapping against her thigh. I knew he was trouble smuggling junk like this. Jamal's jaw dropped, his breath catching in his throat, his hands clutching the shattered piece as if it could shield him from the absurdity of her lie, his voice steady but edged with disbelief. "This is my invention, not contraband," he said, holding it up for the cabin to see, its delicate wiring glinting under the dim light, a testament to years of sleepless nights and relentless hope. But Karen didn't flinch, her sneer widening, as she spun toward the cockpit door, banging on it with a fist, her voice climbing into a near shriek. "We need an emergency landing now. He's a security risk." The passengers erupted into a chorus of gasps and whispers, the woman in the blazer spilling her drink onto her lap, her face paling as she muttered, "What's happening?" while the gray-haired man leaned forward, his voice gruff. "This is ridiculous, lady. Leave him alone." But Karen ignored them, her radio crackling as she barked into it, her words garbled but urgent, and within seconds, the cockpit door swung open, revealing Hank, the co-pilot, a hulking figure with a buzz cut and a scowl carved from years of barking, orders in the military. His boots thudded against the floor as he lumbered into the galley, his broad shoulders filling the narrow space, his gray eyes flicking from Karen to Jamal with a cold, calculating glint that sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. "What's the problem?" Hank growled, his voice a low rumble that matched the engines, and Karen jabbed her finger at Jamal again, her tone dripping with false urgency. "He's got illegal equipment. I found it in his bag. We can't risk it." Hank didn't hesitate, didn't ask for proof, his gaze settling on Jamal like a predator sizing up its next meal, and he stepped closer, towering over him, his meaty hands flexing at his sides. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice a command that brooked no argument, and Jamal rose slowly, his heart pounding, his hands still clutching the broken circuit, his mind screaming that this couldn't be real, that a flight attendant and a co-pilot couldn't turn his life upside down over a lie. The cabin watched in stunned silence, the air thick with their collective tension, the woman in the blazer shrinking back into her seat, while the gray-haired man shook his head, muttering, "This ain't right." Hank loomed over Jamal, his breath hot and stale, and he growled, "You're under suspicion. We're landing in Boise, and you'll be detained when we hit the ground." Jamal's chest tightened, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "Detained? For what?" "This is my work. I've got papers to prove it." But Hank cut him off, his hand clamping onto Jamal's shoulder, squeezing hard enough to bruise, his words a snarl. "Save it for the cops, pal. I don't trust you." The galley curtain fluttered as a teenage girl with a messy bun and a phone slipped into view, her fingers trembling as she filmed the scene, her voice a whisper caught on the mic. "This is wrong. He didn't do anything. Her screen glowed with the live feed, capturing Hank's grip, Karen's smirk, Jamal's defiance, and the passenger's growing unease. A digital lifeline that Jamal didn't yet know existed. Hank noticed her, his head snapping toward the girl, and he barked, "Put that away." But she ducked back, her footage already streaming, and for a moment, Jamal thought he'd caught a break, that the truth might save him. Hank's grip loosened, his eyes flicking to Karen with a hint of doubt, and he stepped back muttering, "We'll sort this on the ground." Jamal sank into his seat, his pulse slowing, his hands shaking as he gathered the broken pieces, thinking the worst was over, that the girl's video might force them to back off. That reason might prevail. But as Hank retreated to the cockpit and Karen lingered in the galley, her smirk never fading, something glinted in her hand, a flash of steel that caught the light just before she slipped it into his bag, a knife, small and sharp, planted with a flick of her wrist as she turned away, her footsteps fading into the hum. Jamal didn't see it, didn't hear the soft clink as it settled among his tools, his sketches, his dreams. But the cabin felt colder, the air heavier, the weight of her next move already pressing down on him, a trap he couldn't yet sense. He clutched the circuit tighter, his jaw set, his mind racing to rebuild what she'd broken, telling himself he'd survived her again, that he could still make it to Seattle intact. He was wrong, so wrong, and the plane soared on, its engines, a steady roar masking the chaos about to erupt. The first-class cabin of the red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle shuddered as turbulence rocked the plane, its engines growling through the night sky at 30,000 feet, the dim lights flickering like a failing pulse, casting jagged pools of shadow across the plush seats where tension coiled tighter with every passing second. Jamal Carter stood near his row, his lean frame rigid, his dark eyes burning with a quiet fury as he clutched the broken remnants of his solar battery prototype, its shattered circuits and tangled wires, a painful reminder of Karen Voss's last attack, the planted knife still hidden in his bag, a ticking bomb he hadn't yet discovered. The air buzzed with the sour sting of recycled oxygen and the faint metallic clank of overhead bins rattling. The cabin a pressure cooker ready to blow, its passengers caught in a web of unease that had spun out from the galley where Karen's voice still echoed, her false accusations now a spark igniting something uglier. Around him, the first-class elite shifted restlessly, the woman in the blazer wiping spilled gin from her lap, her face pale and drawn, while the gray-haired man gripped his armrest, his knuckles whitening as he muttered curses under his breath, his earlier gruff support for Jamal fading into a nervous silence. The teenage girl with the messy bun crouched near the galley curtain, her phone trembling in her hands, its screen glowing with the live feed she'd been streaming since Hank's retreat. Her whispered, "This is wrong," now a faint lifeline lost in the rising chaos. Karen emerged from the shadows, her wiry frame vibrating with a manic energy, her blonde ponytail swinging wildly as she stormed back into the aisle, her pale eyes glinting with a vicious glee that made Jamal's stomach lurch, her clipboard discarded, her hands free to gesture wildly as she turned to the passengers. "He's a threat!" she shouted, her voice a piercing wail that cut through the engine's roar, her finger jabbing at Jamal like a spear, her words dripping with venom as she pointed to the broken prototype on his tray. "He's got illegal gear and he's putting us all in danger." The cabin erupted, gasps and murmurs swelling into a wave of panic, the woman in the blazer shrinking back, her glass tumbling to the floor with a sharp crack while a burly man in a red polo 2 rows back lurched to his feet, his face flushed with booze and rage, his meaty fists clenching as he bellowed, "We don't want you here!" Karen seized the moment, her smirk twisting into a snarl as she egged him on, her voice rising over the din. "See? He doesn't belong. He's trouble. We need him gone." Jamal's heart slammed against his ribs, his hands tightening around the circuit, his mind racing to process the shift, the absurdity of a flight attendant turning passengers into a mob over a lie. But before he could speak, the burly man charged, his bulk barreling down the aisle, his arm swinging as he grabbed Jamal's shoulder, yanking him hard enough to send the tray table crashing. "Get out!" the man roared, his breath hot with whiskey, his grip bruising as others joined in, a wiry guy in a tracksuit leaping up, his voice a high-pitched yelp. "He's gonna crash us!" Jamal shoved back, his lean strength surprising the burly man, his elbow connecting with the guy's chest, sending him stumbling into the seat, But Karen screamed, "Assault! He's attacking us!" Her words, a match tossed into gasoline, the cabin exploding into chaos as more passengers surged forward, their faces twisted with fear and hate. A woman in a silk scarf clawing at Jamal's arm, her nails drawing blood, while a skinny kid in a hoodie shouted, "Throw him off!" The turbulence hit again, harder, the plane lurching violently, lights blinking out for a split second, plunging the cabin into a strobe-lit nightmare, the mob's shouts blending with the creak of metal and the howl of wind outside. Jamal fought, to stay upright, his back slamming against the window, his hands shielding the prototype as blows rained down, a fist grazing his jaw, a knee jabbing his thigh, his voice lost in the roar as he yelled, "Stop! It's a lie!" The teenage girl pushed through, her phone still rolling, her voice cracking as she cried, "Leave him alone." But the mob ignored her, their frenzy fed by Karen's relentless shrieks, her figure darting through the chaos, her eyes wild with triumph. Then, as suddenly as it began, the mob faltered, the burly man stepping back, panting, his face red and slick with sweat, the others hesitating as the plane steadied, the lights flickering back on, the girl's video streaming live to thousands, online via the plane's Wi-Fi, her footage a blurry whirlwind of fists and screams that spread like wildfire across screens far below. Jamal slumped against his seat, his chest heaving, his shirt torn, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek, his prototype clutched to his chest like a lifeline, his eyes scanning the cabin as the passengers retreated, their rage spent, their faces now a mix of shame and confusion. Karen stood at the galley edge, her smirk fading into a scowl, her hands on her hips as she glared at him, her victory soured by the sudden calm. But her radio crackled again, her fingers brushing it as she muttered something low and sharp. Jamal thought he'd won, that the mob's collapse and the girl's video had turned the tide, that he could breathe again, that the worst was behind him. But Hank's heavy boots thudded back into the aisle, his buzz-cut head gleaming under the lights, his gray eyes cold and unyielding, his hands holding a pair of zip ties that glinted like steel cuffs, his voice a growl that froze the cabin. "You're not off the hook, pal. Hands behind your back." Jamal's stomach dropped, his relief shattering into shards of dread, his hands trembling as he clutched the broken circuit, his mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, that a co-pilot couldn't bind him mid-flight over nothing. The girl gasped, her phone dipping as she filmed, the passengers murmuring again, the woman in the blazer whispering, "This is insane." But no one moved, their earlier fire snuffed out by Hank's looming presence. Karen's smirk returned, a slow, vicious curl of her lips as she watched Hank approach, the knife in Jamal's bag still unseen, its blade a silent promise of worse to come, a trap tightening around him with every step. The plane soared on, its engines a relentless drone, the cabin a cage closing in, and Jamal sat frozen, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on Hank, telling himself he could talk his way out, that the truth would hold, that he'd survived the mob and could survive this too. He was wrong. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning to rage. The cockpit broadcast crackled through the first-class cabin of the red-eye flight from Atlanta to Seattle, its engines snarling as the plane bucked against fierce turbulence 30,000 feet above a sleeping world, the dim lights stuttering, like a heartbeat on the brink, casting wild shadows across the seats where chaos had erupted and now hung in a fragile, trembling pause. Jamal Carter sat slumped in row 3, his lean frame bruised and battered, his dark eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and exhaustion, his torn shirt clinging to his sweat-slicked skin as he clutched the broken shards of his solar battery prototype, its jagged edges cutting into his palms, a lifeline to a dream Karen Voss had tried to rip apart with her mob. The air reeked of spilled whiskey and fear, the cabin a battlefield littered with overturned trays and shattered glass, the woman in the blazer trembling in her seat, her gin-soaked lap a testament to the madness, while the gray-haired man stared. Ahead, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself to sanity. The teenage girl with the messy bun crouched near the galley, her phone still glowing with the viral video that had streamed the mob's attack to thousands online, her shaky footage a beacon in the dark, her whispered pleas lost in the roar of the engines and the pounding of Jamal's pulse. Hank, the co-pilot, loomed over him, his buzz-cut head glistening with sweat, his gray eyes cold as steel, his meaty hands twirling the zip ties that glinted under the flickering lights. his growl still echoing in Jamal's ears, a promise of bondage that had frozen the cabin into a tense hush. Karen stood at the galley's edge, her wiry frame rigid, her blonde ponytail askew, her pale eyes glinting with a vicious triumph as she watched Hank close in, the planted knife in Jamal's bag, a secret weapon she thought would seal his fate. Her smirk a razor-sharp slash across her face. The passengers held their breath, the woman in the blazer whispering, "Someone stop this," her voice a threadbare plea, while the burly man in the red polo nursed his bruised chest, his rage simmering into a sullen glare. Then the cockpit door slammed open, a thunderclap that jolted the cabin, and Marla Evans stormed in, the head flight attendant, a no-nonsense black woman with a commanding presence that cut through the chaos like a blade. Her dark hair pulled, tight in a bun, her brown eyes flashing with a fury that matched Jamal's own, her uniform pristine but her stride fierce, a force of nature barreling down the aisle. Her voice boomed over the intercom as she snatched it from its cradle, her words a whip cracking through the air. "Karen Voss, you're done, fired, effective now, get to the back of this plane and stay there." The cabin erupted in cheers, a ragged wave of relief washing over the passengers, the woman in the blazer clapping her hands, her face lighting up, while the gray-haired man nodded sharply, muttering, "About damn time." Karen's smirk vanished, her face crumpling into a mask of shock and rage, her mouth opening to protest. But Marla cut her off, her finger jabbing the air as she marched forward, her boots thudding against the carpet. "Not a word, you've crossed every line. Move." Hank froze, his zip ties dangling, his gray eyes flicking between Marla and Karen, his authority crumbling under her glare. And he stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides, his growl silenced by her presence. Marla grabbed Karen's arm, hauling her toward the rear, the blonde sobs breaking through the cheers as she stumbled, her ponytail swinging wildly, her power stripped away in an instant. Jamal exhaled, his chest loosening, his hands unclenching. From the prototype, his bloodied palms stinging as he sank back into his seat. The weight of the mob's fists lifting. The zip ties no longer a threat. The cabin's roar fading into a stunned murmur. Marla returned, her eyes softening as she knelt beside him, her voice low and firm. "You okay, sir? This shouldn't have happened." Jamal nodded, his throat tight, his words a rasp. "Thanks, I thought I was done." She spotted the broken circuit, her brow creasing, and then her gaze landed on his bag, her hand brushing its edge as she pulled out the planted knife, its blade glinting in her palm, her face hardening with a realization that sent a chill through Jamal's spine. "This isn't yours," she said, her voice a steel whisper, and she tucked it into her pocket, her eyes locking with his, a silent promise to unravel the trap. Jamal thought it was over, that Marla's intervention had crushed Karen's scheme, that he could breathe, rebuild, make it to Seattle intact, his faith in justice flickering back to life. But as Marla stood, her radio crackling with static, Hank leaned toward Karen in the rear, his voice a low hiss cutting through the hum. "We'll fix this on the ground." Karen's sobs stopped, her head snapping up, her pale eyes narrowing. With a renewed venom, her fingers brushing her own radio as she nodded, a pact sealed in the shadows. Marla didn't hear, her focus on Jamal, her hand resting on his shoulder. But he saw it, the flicker of conspiracy in Hank's glare, the knife's absence a temporary shield, not a victory. The plane shuddered again, its engines a relentless growl, the light steadying as the cabin settled, but the air around Jamal thickened, his relief souring into dread, his mind racing with the certainty that Karen and Hank weren't done, that the ground held dangers he couldn't yet see. He gripped the prototype tighter, his jaw set, his eyes darting to Marla, telling himself she'd protect him, that the truth was on his side, that he'd won this round. He was wrong. The battle was far from over, and the storm was about to break wide open. Hey viewers, what's your take? Comment number 1 if you're cheering Marla's badass move to shut Karen down. Or number 2 if you think Jamal deserves way more than an apology after that mob attack. Ever seen someone in power step up like Marla did? Drop your thoughts below. Smash that like button if you're pumped to see justice fight back, and subscribe to catch every twist in Jamal's wild ride. Was that knife the end of Karen's tricks? Or is something nastier waiting when they land? Buckle up for the next part. The Seattle airport tarmac stretched out under a shroud of thick fog as the red-eye flight from Atlanta touched down, its engines winding into a low whine, the cabin lights blazing back to full strength after hours of flickering at 30,000 feet, illuminating a scene of exhausted passengers and simmering unease that had festered since Marla's crackling broadcast. Jamal Carter stepped off the plane, his lean frame aching from the mob's blows, his dark eyes shadowed with fatigue but sharp with resolve, his torn shirt hanging loose as he clutched his carry-on bag, the broken solar battery prototype inside, a jagged reminder of the nightmare he'd endured, the planted knife now safely in Marla's pocket, a secret shield he thought would protect him. The air outside hit him like a slap, cold and damp, heavy with the scent of jet fuel and wet asphalt, the fog curling around the jetway in ghostly tendrils that swallowed the distant terminal lights, turning the world into a hazy blur. Around him, passengers shuffled toward the gate, the woman in the blazer dragging her suitcase with a weary sigh, her gin-stained skirt a silent testament to the chaos, while the gray-haired man limped behind, his gruff mutters lost in the shuffle of footsteps and rolling wheels. Marla had lingered on the plane, her commanding figure a steady presence as she'd escorted Karen to the rear, her brown eyes flashing with a promise to handle things, leaving Jamal to disembark alone, his chest loosening with every step, his mind clinging to the hope that the worst was behind him, that Seattle meant a fresh start, a chance to rebuild his prototype and nail his investor meeting. The jetway spat him out onto the tarmac, the fog thickening as he moved toward the terminal, his sneakers scuffing against the gritty pavement, his breath puffing in small clouds, when a shadow loomed ahead, a hulking figure flanked by two others, their silhouettes cutting through the mist like predators on the hunt. Jamal froze, his heart lurching, his eyes narrowing as the shapes resolved into Rick, Karen's brother, a TSA agent with a buzz cut and a sneer that mirrored her venom, his broad chest puffed out under a neon vest, his hands gripping a baton that tapped against his thigh, his two armed guards wielding rifles that glinted in the sodium glow of a nearby floodlight. "Jamal Carter!" Rick barked, his voice a gravelly snarl that echoed across the tarmac. "You're coming with us. Got an anonymous tip about a weapon in your bag." Jamal's stomach plummeted, his hands tightening around the carry-on, his mind racing to Marla's discovery of the knife, his voice steady but edged with confusion. "That's impossible. It's just my prototype. Your supervisor has the proof." But Rick smirked, his lips curling into a vicious grin, his baton twirling as he stepped closer, his guards fanning out to block Jamal's path, their rifles trained on his chest, the barrels steady and cold. "Stay out of it," Rick snapped, as Marla's boots hit the tarmac behind them, her figure emerging from the jetway, her brown eyes widening as she took in the scene, her voice rising sharp and firm. "What's going on here? He's cleared. I've got the evidence." Rick wheeled on her, his sneer deepening, his baton jabbing the air toward her. "Back off, lady. This ain't your jurisdiction. He's ours now." Jamal's pulse hammered, his eyes darting between Rick and Marla, his hope flickering as she squared her shoulders, her hand brushing the pocket where the knife rested, her words a lifeline he clung to. "This is a setup. You can't do this." But Rick laughed, a harsh guttural sound that rolled through the fog, his guards closing in, their boots thudding against the pavement as they seized Jamal's arms, wrenching them behind his back, their grip bruising as they tore the bag from his hands, its zipper ripping open under their force. Jamal struggled, his lean strength no match for their bulk, his voice rising in protest. "Let go! You've got no cause!" But Rick's hand shot out, slamming into Jamal's chest, shoving him toward a squat gray building off the tarmac, its windows dark and uninviting, a holding cell cloaked in the mist. Marla lunged forward, her radio crackling as she shouted, "Stand down, I'm reporting this." But Rick's guards blocked her, their rifles a wall she couldn't breach, her face twisting with fury as Jamal was dragged away, his sneakers scraping the asphalt, his bag dangling from Rick's grip. Inside the cell, the door slammed shut, a clang that echoed in the damp air, the walls cold and slick with condensation, the single bulb overhead buzzing with a sickly yellow glow, and Rick tossed the bag onto a metal table, its contents spilling out, the broken prototype glinting under the light. Jamal stood cuffed, his wrists chafing against the steel, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Rick as the TSA agent smirked, his baton slamming down onto the table, inches from the prototype. his voice a low growl. "You messed with the wrong family, pal." Then, with a slow, deliberate twist, Rick lifted the baton and brought it down hard, smashing the prototype into a dozen pieces. The crack of metal on metal, a gunshot in the silence. Shards flying across the table, embedding in the wall. A $1 million dream reduced to rubble before Jamal's eyes. His shout of rage swallowed by the cell's thick walls. Marla pounded on the door outside, her voice muffled but fierce. "Open this now! You're done!" But Rick ignored her, his guards chuckling as they filmed the destruction, their phones glowing with a live feed that mocked the teenage girl's earlier stream, a cruel reversal of justice. Jamal's knees buckled, his body sagging against the cuffs, his mind reeling as he thought Marla's support would free him, that her evidence would stop this, that the knife's absence would prove his innocence. But Rick's smirk widened, his baton tapping the table, his words a venomous promise. "This is just the start. Wait till we hit you with the real charges." The fog outside thickened, swallowing the tarmac, the plane, the world, and Jamal stood trapped, his prototype in ruins, his hope fraying, his eyes burning with a fury he couldn't unleash, telling himself Marla would break through, that the truth would hold, that he could still fight back. He was wrong. The ground wasn't salvation. It was a deeper hell, and Rick's baton tapped on, a metronome counting down to worse. The airport detention room in Seattle loomed cold and gray around Jamal Carter, its slick concrete walls glistening with dampness under a buzzing fluorescent bulb that cast a harsh, jaundiced glow across the metal table where the shattered remains of his solar battery prototype lay scattered. A $1 million dream pulverized by Rick's baton into a jagged heap of twisted wires and splintered circuits. Jamal stood cuffed, his lean frame trembling with a fury he couldn't unleash. His dark eyes locked on the wreckage, his wrists chafing against the steel restraints as the air thickened with the stale reek of mildew and jet fuel seeping through. The cracked window, the fog outside pressing against the glass like a living shroud. Rick, Karen's brother, towered nearby, his buzz-cut head gleaming under the light, his neon TSA vest stretched tight across his broad chest, his smirk a cruel slash as he twirled his baton, his two armed guards leaning against the wall, their rifles slung casually, their phones still glowing from the video they'd filmed of the prototype's destruction. A taunting echo of the teenage girl's earlier stream now turned against Jamal. The door rattled with Marla's pounding fists, her muffled shout slicing through the silence, her voice a fierce drumbeat demanding entry. But Rick ignored her, his chuckle a low rumble as he tapped the baton against the table, his eyes glinting with a venom that matched his sister's, his words a slow, deliberate jab. "You're finished, pal. Nobody's buying your sob story." Jamal's chest heaved, his torn shirt clinging to his bruised skin, his mind reeling from the ambush on the tarmac, the cuffs, the smashing of his life's work, his hope clinging to Marla's evidence, the knife she'd confiscated, the truth he thought would free him. Then a roar erupted outside, a distant thunder that grew louder, sharper, seeping through the walls, a cacophony of voices chanting his name. "Jamal! Jamal!" A rhythmic pulse that shook the fog-draped airport. Drawing Rick's smirk into a scowl, his head snapping toward the window as shadows flickered beyond the glass. Marla's pounding stopped, her boots scuffing the pavement as she slipped away, her figure vanishing into the mist. And moments later, the door creaked open, her hand thrusting a phone through the gap, its screen blazing with the teenage girl's viral video, now exploded across the internet with millions of views. The mob's fists, Karen's shrieks, Hank's zip ties, all captured in grainy, unfiltered truth. "Look at this," Marla hissed, her brown eyes fierce as she shoved the phone into Jamal's cuffed hands, her voice cutting through Rick's growl. "They're protesting out there. You're not alone." Jamal stared at the screen, his heart thudding, the footage a chaotic whirlwind of his fight, the comments scrolling fast. "Justice for Jamal. This is racism." A digital army rallying as protests swelled outside, their chants vibrating through the concrete, signs bobbing. In the fog, a sea of faces demanding answers. Rick lunged, his baton clattering to the floor, his meaty hand snatching at the phone. But Jamal twisted away, his cuffs clanking, his voice rising sharp and clear. "They see it! You can't hide this!" Marla ducked back out, her radio crackling. As she called for backup, her footsteps fading into the roar, leaving Jamal clutching the phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his lawyer. A wiry guy named Eli he'd met at a tech conference, his voice a lifeline through the static. "Eli, it's me. They've got me locked up. Smash my prototype. You've got to get me out," he rasped, his words tumbling over the chants, his hope surging as Eli's calm reply cut through. "I'm on it. That video's gold. Stay strong." Jamal thought he'd turned the tide, that the protests, the footage, Marla's fight would break him free, that Rick's smirk would crack under the weight of a million eyes watching, judging, raging. But Rick's hand slammed down, ripping the phone from Jamal's grip, his fist crashing into Jamal's jaw with a sickening crunch, blood spilling hot and coppery down his chin as Rick snarled, "You'll pay for ruining her, you piece of trash." The guards laughed, their rifles shifting as they stepped closer, one kicking the table, sending prototype shards skittering across the floor, the other grabbing Jamal's arm, twisting it hard enough to pop the joint, pain exploding white-hot through his shoulder. Rick loomed over him, his baton back in hand, his neon vest glowing like a warning sign, his voice a guttural promise as he leaned in close, his breath sour with rage. "Think those clowns outside can save you? You're nothing, and I'll make sure you stay that way." Jamal's knees hit the floor, his cuffed hands scrabbling for balance, his blood pooling on the concrete, his vision blurring as the chants grew louder, a lifeline he couldn't reach, his mind screaming that Marla would burst back in, that Eli would storm the gates, that the viral wave would drown Rick's brutality. But the door stayed shut, the fog thickened, the bulb buzzed on, and Rick's baton rose again, its shadow stretching long and dark across the wall, a pendulum swinging toward worse. Jamal's head throbbed, his shoulder screamed. His prototype lay in ruins, and he thought he'd lost everything, that the protests were just noise, that Rick's power was unbreakable, that Karen's revenge had won. Then a faint buzz hummed from his pocket. The phone Marla had slipped him vibrating with a text from Eli. "Hold on, we're coming." A flicker of light in the dark, but Rick's fist tightened, his guards closed in, and Jamal's hope frayed, his eyes burning with a rage he couldn't release, his body braced for the next blow, telling himself the world was watching, that it had to matter, that he could still fight. He was wrong. The backlash was only fuel, and Rick's vengeance was a fire about to roar higher, the cell a cage he couldn't escape. Not yet. Not like this. The airport security office in Seattle hummed with a sickly buzz from overhead fluorescents, their harsh light bathing the cold gray room where Jamal Carter slumped against a metal chair, his lean frame battered, his dark eyes bloodshot and blazing with a fury he could barely contain, his wrists raw from cuffs now removed, his torn shirt stained with drying blood that pooled from his split lip and bruised jaw, a grim map of Rick's brutality etched across his skin. The shattered remnants of his solar battery prototype littered the floor, glinting dully amid scuff marks and dust, a $1 million dream crushed under Rick's baton, its jagged pieces a silent scream of everything Jamal had lost in the span of hours, the air thick with the rancid stench of sweat and mildew, the fog outside pressing against the barred window like a suffocating veil. Rick paced nearby, his buzz-cut head slick with sweat, his neon TSA vest glowing under the lights, his broad hands flexing as he barked orders to his two guards, their rifles slung low, their smirks mirroring his as they lounged against the wall, their phones now dark after filming the prototype's ruin, a cruel trophy of their power. The protests outside roared louder, a tidal wave of chants crashing against the building. "Justice for Jamal!" Their voices vibrating through the concrete, signs slashing through the fog, a sea of outrage sparked by the teenage girl's viral video. Millions of eyes now locked on this nightmare unfolding in real time. Jamal's chest heaved, his shoulder throbbing where a guard had twisted it, his mind clinging to Eli's text. "Hold on, we're coming." A fragile thread of hope amid the wreckage, his ears straining for Marla's boots, her radio, anything, to signal rescue. But the door stayed shut, the silence inside a stark contrast to the chaos beyond. Then Rick spun toward him, his sneer twisting into a snarl, his voice a guttural growl that sliced through the buzz. "You're done, Carter. Felony assault on an officer. I've got witnesses." He spat, jabbing a finger at his own chest, his baton tapping the table where a forged report now sat, its ink still wet, claiming Jamal had lunged at him in the cell, a lie so bold it made Jamal's stomach churn, his protest rising sharp and ragged. "That's a lie. You hit me. The video proves it." But Rick laughed, a harsh bark that echoed off the walls, his guards chuckling as he tossed the report to them, their nods a silent pact to back his story, their rifles shifting as they straightened, ready to enforce the fiction. The door creaked open, and Karen slunk in, her wiry frame hunched but her blonde ponytail swinging with a defiant flick, her pale eyes glinting with a venom that hadn't dimmed despite Marla's firing, her uniform swapped for a civilian jacket. Her presence a shock that made Jamal's blood run cold, his mind screaming she shouldn't be here, not after everything. "He attacked me too," she lied, her voice a venomous hiss as she stepped to a live feed camera Rick had set up, her face filling a screen that broadcast to a local news outlet, her smirk returning as she spun her tale. "He's violent. Dangerous, I warned them on the plane." Jamal lunged forward, his chair screeching against the floor, his voice a roar. "You set me up, you planted that knife." But Rick's fist slammed into his gut, doubling him over, his breath exploding. In a wheeze as the guards grabbed his arms, pinning him back, their grip iron tight, their laughter a cruel chorus. The protests outside swelled, a siren wailing in the distance, and then the door burst open, Eli storming in, a wiry figure in a rumpled suit, his glasses glinting under the lights, his voice a whip crack as he shoved a tablet at Rick, its screen glowing with the viral video, timestamps flashing clear as day, proving Jamal's innocence, the mob's chaos, Karen's lies all laid bare. "You've got nothing, this ends now," Eli snapped, his finger jabbing the air, his calm shattered by a fury that matched Jamal's, his eyes locking with Rick's as the TSA agent's smirk faltered, his baton dropping to his side, his guards stepping back, their rifles dipping. Karen's face paled on the feed, her lies unraveling as Eli turned to Jamal, his voice low and urgent. "You're out. Let's go." And the guards released him, their hands falling away, their smirks gone as Rick growled, "This ain't over." Jamal staggered to his feet, his legs shaky, his chest heaving, his hopes surging as Eli let him out. The protests a triumphant roar in his ears, the fog parting to reveal a crowd cheering his name, his freedom a hard-won breath after hours of suffocation, his mind racing with relief, thinking he'd beaten them, that the truth had prevailed, that Seattle was his again. But as he reached the terminal, sirens blared louder. A SWAT team swarmed from the shadows, their black gear glinting in the sodium lights, their rifles raised, their commander barking, "Jamal Carter, you're under arrest. Domestic terrorism. Step away from the civilian." Jamal froze, his heart plummeting, his eyes darting to Eli, who shouted, "What the hell?" As Rick emerged behind them, his sneer back, his voice a low taunt. "Told you it ain't over? Tip came from me." The crowd screamed, their chants turning to chaos, and Jamal's hands rose, his freedom snatched away, his mind reeling as the SWAT cuffs snapped on, his prototype gone, his victory a mirage, his hope shattered by a frame-up that dwarfed everything before. Rick's revenge a sledgehammer that kept swinging, Karen's lies a noose tightening around him, the fog swallowing his world as he was dragged away, telling himself Eli would fix this, that the video would hold, that he could still fight. He was wrong. The trap was deeper, and the nightmare was just beginning. Hey, viewers, what's your call? Comment number 1 if you're raging at Rick and Karen's disgusting frame-up, or number 2 if you think Jamal's lawyer can still pull him out of this mess. Ever seen a lie this bold blow up in someone's face? Drop your stories below, smash that like button if you're rooting for Jamal to flip this insanity, and subscribe to see how he battles this nightmare next. Did Rick just ruin everything? Or is there a way out of this SWAT trap? Hang on tight for what's coming. The Seattle streets pulsed with a chaotic symphony of blaring sirens and whirring news helicopters as Jamal Carter stumbled through the fog-draped night, his lean frame hunched and aching, his dark eyes darting wildly, his torn shirt flapping against his bruised skin, his wrists raw from the SWAT cuffs that had snapped on moments ago, only to be cut loose when Eli's shouts in the viral video forced a fleeting retreat, the terrorism charge teetering on the edge of collapse but not yet dead. The air hung heavy with the damp chill of rain-soaked asphalt and the acrid sting of exhaust. The city a labyrinth of shadows and sodium lights that flickered through the mist. his breath puffing in ragged clouds as he ducked into an alley, his sneakers splashing through puddles, his chest heaving with a mix of adrenaline and dread, the shattered remnants of his solar battery prototype. A ghost haunting his empty hands, its loss a wound that bled deeper with every step. Around him the world had turned against him, news vans screeching to a halt blocks away, their screens blazing with Rick's fabricated confession, a distorted voice claiming Jamal was a fraud, a terrorist, a danger, the words looping on every channel, pressured by Rick's connections into a media storm that drowned out the protests, their chants fading into a confused murmur as signs drooped in the rain, their ink running like tears. Jamal pressed against a brick wall, its rough surface scraping his back, his mind racing to process the SWAT raid, Eli's desperate scramble to free him, the crowd's roar that had briefly lifted him only to crash into betrayal, his lawyers, tablet now useless against a tidal wave of lies, his hope clinging to Marla's promise, her fierce stand on the tarmac a lifeline he couldn't reach. The alley reeked of rotting trash and gasoline, its shadows swallowing him as he crouched behind a dumpster, his ears straining for the thud of boots, the crackle of radios, the SWAT team still hunting, their black gear a specter in the fog, their rifles glinting whenever headlights swept past, a manhunt fueled by Rick's venom and Karen's planted knife, its absence a hollow victory in this spiraling nightmare. Then a figure emerged from the mist, Marla, her commanding frame cutting through the rain, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her brown eyes blazing with a fury that matched his own, her uniform soaked, but her stride unbroken, her voice a low, urgent whisper as she knelt beside him, her hand gripping his arm. "Jamal, we've got to move. They're everywhere, but I'm with you," she said, her words a lifeline pulling him from the edge, her radio crackling with static as she scanned the alley, her presence a shield he hadn't expected, her promise to testify a flicker of light in the dark. Jamal nodded, his throat tight, his voice a rasp. "They're lying about me, Marla. It's all fake." And she squeezed his arm, her jaw set, her reply fierce. "I know. I saw it all. We'll prove it." He thought he'd found an anchor, that Marla's truth could pierce the media's fog, that together they could turn the tide, his chest loosening as she pulled him toward a side street, her plan unfolding in hushed tones, a route to safety, a chance to fight back. But then a red dot danced across her chest, a sniper's laser slicing through the rain, and before Jamal could shout, a crack split the air, a bullet slamming into Marla's sternum, her body jerking back, her brown eyes widening in shock as blood bloomed dark and wet across her uniform, her knees buckling as she crumpled to the asphalt, her radio tumbling into a puddle, its static a dying gasp. Jamal lunged for her, his hands scrabbling at her shoulders, his scream raw and ragged. "No, Marla, no!" But her eyes fluttered shut, her breath gone, her fierce light snuffed out in an instant, the sniper vanishing into the fog, a shadow, sent by Rick's relentless hate, a kill shot that turned ally into martyr, leaving Jamal alone, his hands slick with her blood, his mind shattering as helicopters buzzed closer, their blades chopping the night. He staggered back, his sneakers slipping in the wet, his chest heaving as he ran, his eyes blurring with rain and tears, his hope gutted by her death, the alley a tunnel closing in, the media's lies a noose tightening, the protesters' voices, now a distant wail, some turning against him misled by the fake confession. Their signs trampled in the mud. He ducked behind a rusted van, his hands shaking as he fumbled in his pocket, finding Marla's phone, its screen cracked but alive, a notification flashing from Eli. "Found Karen's audio, she's bragging, uploading now." A leaked recording. From the plane, her voice gloating about the setup, a lifeline he seized as he hit play, her venomous laugh spilling into the night. "He's done. We've got him." A truth that could reignite the fight. A weapon against the betrayal. Jamal clutched the phone, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a renewed fire, his mind racing as he thought Marla's death wasn't in vain, that the audio could flip the script, that he could still run, still win, still expose them. His breath steadying as he slipped deeper into the shadows, telling himself the public would see, that Eli would spread it, that he could outlast this storm. He was wrong. The betrayal was a blade that kept cutting, and the streets held horrors he couldn't yet fathom, the rain a curtain falling on a war far from over. The abandoned warehouse on the edge of Seattle loomed like a skeletal relic against the storm-ravaged night, its rusted walls shuddering as rain pounded the roof, a relentless drumbeat that drowned out the distant wail of sirens and the fading chop of news helicopters, the fog curling thick around its broken windows, a shroud hiding Jamal Carter as he crouched inside, his lean frame soaked and shivering, his dark eyes blazing with a desperate fire, his torn shirt clinging to his bruised skin. Marla's blood still staining his hands, a grim tattoo of her sacrifice etched into his palms. The air reeked of mold and oil, the floor slick with puddles that reflected the faint glow of a flickering bulb swaying overhead, its light dancing across the cracked concrete where he clutched Marla's cracked phone, its screen glowing with Karen's leaked audio, her gloating voice looping in his ears. "He's done. We've got him." A weapon he'd uploaded online minutes ago, reigniting the protests with a vengeance, their chants echoing faintly through the walls. A lifeline, pulling him from despair. His chest heaved, his shoulder throbbing from the guard's twist, his jaw aching from Rick's fist, his mind racing with Marla's death, the SWAT raid, the media's lies, every blow a hammer driving him here, to this crumbling hideout where shadows stretched long and menacing, the city a battlefield beyond the rain-streaked glass. He'd run from the alley, his sneakers pounding the wet streets, his breath ragged as he dodged SWAT vans and news crews, the audio his shield, Eli's text his guide. "It's live. Keep moving." A promise that the truth was spreading, that the public's rage was turning back to his side, their signs rising again in the storm. Jamal's innocent. A roar he could barely hear over the rain's fury. Then a new sound cut through, a sharp crackle from a radio outside, followed by boots crunching gravel, and Jamal's heart lurched, his eyes darting to the window as shadows moved, 3 figures in tactical gear slipping through the fog. There, rifles glinting, their voices low and clipped, mercenaries hired by a power he hadn't yet named, their steps deliberate as they closed in, a trap snapping shut. He ducked behind a rusted crate, his hands trembling as he pulled the phone closer, its battery flickering at 10%. His mind screaming that Rick and Karen couldn't reach him here, that the protest would scare them off, that he'd outrun their revenge. But the door crashed open, a splintering boom that shook the walls, and the mercenaries stormed in, their boots splashing through puddles, their rifles sweeping the dark, their leader barking, "Find him now." Jamal held his breath, his body pressed tight against the crate, his eyes tracking their shadows, his hope fraying as he realized this wasn't Rick's doing, not Karen's, but something bigger, colder, a machine grinding him down. Then a voice sliced through the static. Victor Grayson, the airline CEO, his slick tones crackling from a mercenary's earpiece. "Kill him. He's a liability. The prototype's ours." A revelation that hit Jamal like a punch, his mind flashing. To the investor meeting, the deal Victor must have wanted, the invention Rick had smashed, now a prize fueling this hunt. Jamal's fury surged, his hands fumbling as he grabbed a rusted pipe from the floor, its weight cold and solid, his breath steadying as he waited, his plan forming in the dark, a chance to strike back, to turn their game against them. The mercenaries fanned out, their boots thudding closer, their rifles clicking as they chambered rounds, and Jamal lunged, his pipe swinging hard, cracking the nearest one's skull with a wet crunch, the man crumpling to the floor, his rifle skittering across the concrete, a prize Jamal seized, its grip slick in his bloody hands, his heart pounding as he ducked back, the others spinning toward the sound, their shouts a chaotic roar. He fired, a wild burst that lit the warehouse in flashes, bullets pinging off metal, one mercenary staggering as blood sprayed from his thigh, the other diving for cover, their radios crackling with Victor's rage. "Finish him," Jamal thought. He'd gained ground, that the gun, the audio, the protests could hold them off, that he could fight his way out, his chest swelling with a fleeting triumph as he reloaded, his hands steady despite the pain, his mind racing with a plan to expose Victor, to end this nightmare. But then the news flickered on a mercenary's phone, a live broadcast piercing the chaos, Victor's voice smooth and oily. "Jamal Carter's a fraud. Here's his confession." A fake recording of Jamal admitting guilt, his voice warped by tech, a lie so slick it turned the protests silent, the chants faltering, the crowd's faith cracking under the weight of corporate deceit. A reversal that hit Jamal harder than any bullet, his hope gutted as the mercenaries regrouped. There, Rifles rising, their leader snarling, "You're done, freak." Jamal fired again, his shots wild, his pipe swinging as he fought, his body screaming, his mind reeling from the betrayal, the rain pounding louder, the warehouse a cage closing in, his gun clicking empty as the mercenaries closed the gap, their boots splashing, their rifles steady. Victor's voice a ghost in the static, a puppet master pulling strings Jamal couldn't cut, his fight a spark in a storm about to snuff out, his eyes burning with a rage he couldn't release, telling himself the audio would hold, that Eli would counter this, that he could still win. He was wrong. The corporate revenge was a tidal wave, and he was drowning. The warehouse a tomb he couldn't escape. Not yet. Not like this. The airline headquarters rooftop in Seattle loomed stark and windswept against a raging storm, its slick concrete expanse glistening under torrents of rain that lashed the night. The city lights below a blurry kaleidoscope through the fog, their glow swallowed by thunderclouds that roared with a fury matching Jamal Carter's own as he crouched behind an air vent, his lean frame soaked and trembling, his dark eyes blazing with a resolve forged through hours of hell, his torn shirt whipping in the wind, his hands slick with Marla's blood and his own. The rusted pipe from the warehouse clutched tight, its weight a lifeline in the chaos. The air crackled with ozone and the distant wail of sirens, the rooftop a battleground 30 stories above the streets where protests flickered, their chants muted by the storm. Karen's leaked audio still rippling online but drowned by Victor. Grayson's fake confession, a lie that had turned the world against him. Its echo a ghost in his ears as he slipped through the building's shadows, his sneakers silent on the stairs, his breath ragged from the fight in the warehouse. The mercenaries, rifle now empty, discarded, his body aching from every blow, every betrayal, every loss. He'd infiltrated the HQ, a maze of glass and steel, his mind locked on Victor, the CEO whose mercenaries had hunted him, whose greed had stolen his prototype, whose voice had framed him, a slick puppet master now within reach, the storm a cloak, hiding Jamal's ascent, his fury a fire that burned hotter with every step. Marla's death, Rick's baton, Karen's knife all fuel driving him here, to this final stand. The rooftop door banged open, a gust of wind howling through, and Victor emerged, a tall figure in a tailored suit, his silver hair plastered to his skull, his sharp features twisted with a cold arrogance, his voice a sneer cutting through the rain. "Carter, you're a fool to come here," he shouted, his hand gripping a sleek pistol, its barrel glinting as lightning split the sky, his words a taunt that matched the mercenaries' radios, a confirmation of the corporate revenge. Jamal had dodged but couldn't outrun. Then Karen stumbled out behind him, her wiry frame hunched against the wind, her blonde ponytail sodden, her pale eyes wild with a venom that hadn't faded, her civilian jacket flapping as she clutched a shard of Jamal's broken prototype, its jagged edge a cruel trophy, her laugh a high-pitched cackle that pierced the thunder. "You're nothing, we've won," she spat, her voice a venomous echo of her gloating audio. Her presence a shock that made Jamal's blood boil, his mind screaming she shouldn't be free. Not after Marla. Not after everything. He stepped from the shadows, his pipe raised, his voice a roar over the storm. "You're done, both of you, I've got proof," he shouted, pulling Marla's phone, its cracked screen glowing as he hit record. His words a weapon aimed at Victor's smug grin, his plan to broadcast the truth, to end this nightmare live for the world to see. Victor laughed, a slick, oily sound, his pistol rising as he fired, the bullet grazing Jamal's arm, blood blooming hot and wet, his pipe clattering as he stumbled, his phone skittering across the roof, its red light still blinking, still streaming. Karen lunged, her shard slashing, its edge sinking into Jamal's side, a searing pain that buckled his knees, her scream a triumphant wail. "Die, you filth!" she shrieked, her face a mask of hate, her hands twisting the shard deeper, blood soaking his shirt as he gasped, his vision blurring, his body screaming as he fought back, his fist slamming into her jaw, sending her sprawling, her shard clattering free, her body hitting the concrete with a wet thud, her eyes rolling back as she lay still, a puppet cut loose. Victor advanced, his pistol steady, his voice a growl. "You're too late, the world believes me." But Jamal rolled, his hand snatching the phone, his thumb smashing play. Victor's earlier radio command. "Kill him. The prototype's ours." Spilling into the storm, the live feed spiking. Online, millions tuning in as lightning flashed, illuminating Victor's snarl, his finger tightening on the trigger. Jamal surged, his body screaming, his pipe swinging up, cracking Victor's wrist, the pistol flying into the rain. His roar, a primal sound as he tackled the CEO, their bodies crashing to the roof, fists flying, blood mixing with water, the phone, tumbling but still recording, its lens capturing every blow, every shout. A truth the world couldn't ignore. Cops swarmed from the stairwell, their boots splashing, their rifles raised, their shouts a chaotic chorus as they surrounded the scene. Victor pinned under Jamal's knee, his suit torn, his silver hair wild, his voice a desperate rasp. "He's the terrorist. Arrest him." But the feed blared on, Victor's confession echoing, the cops hesitating, their eyes darting to the phone, to Jamal, to the blood. The storm a witness as they cuffed Victor instead, his snarls fading into the wind, his empire crumbling under. The weight of his own words, the audio a sledgehammer that shattered his lies. The protests below erupting anew, a roar of triumph piercing the rain. Jamal staggered back, his side bleeding, his arm throbbing, his chest heaving as the cops dragged Victor away. Karen's limp form hauled off, his victory a bitter taste as he clutched the phone, its battery dying, its truth alive, his mind racing, with relief, thinking he'd won, that the nightmare was over, that justice had prevailed. His breath steadying as he sank to his knees, the city lights glowing through the fog. A beacon of hope after hours of darkness. But then a crack split the air, a sniper's bullet slamming into his chest, its force knocking him flat, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes widening as a shadow flickered on a distant roof. A hidden hand striking one last blow, his phone slipping from his grasp, its screen fading to black, his vision tunneling, his hope snuffed out by a final unseen enemy. The storm raging on, the cops shouting, the world watching. His fight ending in a gasp, telling himself it was enough, that he'd exposed them, that he'd won. He was wrong, the battle was won, but the war wasn't over, and the rain fell harder, washing his blood into the night. The hospital room in Seattle hummed with the steady beep of machines, their rhythmic pulse a fragile thread tethering Jamal Carter to life. His lean frame sprawled across a sterile bed, his dark eyes fluttering open beneath a haze of painkillers, his chest wrapped in bandages where the sniper's bullet had torn through, blood seeping through gauze, a crimson stain against the white sheets, his torn shirt replaced by a thin gown, his hands twitching as sensation crept back, the air thick, with antiseptic and the faint echo of rain still drumming against the window, a storm that hadn't relented since the rooftop showdown. Tubes snaked from his arms, monitors glowed with jagged lines tracking his heartbeat, his breath shallow but stubborn, his mind clawing through the fog of near death, the memory of Victor's snarling face, Karen's shard in his side, the cops, shouts, the sniper's crack all crashing back, a whirlwind of chaos that had left him here, alive but broken. The city lights beyond the glass a distant blur through the drizzle, a world he'd fought to reclaim now holding its breath. Nurses moved in quiet orbits, their sneakers squeaking on the linoleum, their voices a soft murmur as they adjusted drips and checked charts, one pausing to brush a damp cloth across his forehead, her touch gentle, her eyes shadowed with a pity. He couldn't read. The room a cocoon shielding him from the storm outside, from the war he'd waged, from the blood and betrayal that had nearly ended him. Days blurred into weeks, his body mending slower than his will, his mind sharpening with every news report flickering on the wall-mounted TV. Victor Grayson and Karen Voss convicted, their faces grim in orange jumpsuits, the courtroom a stage, where Marla's phone, recovered from the roof, played its final act. Victor's confession, kill him, the prototype's ours, a hammer that smashed their lies. The audio synced with Jamal's rooftop stream, a double blow that sent them to prison, their empire of greed and hate crumbling under the weight of a million witnesses, the protests swelling into a movement, donations pouring in, millions strong, to rebuild his invention, his name a rallying cry on lips he'd never meet. Jamal's chest tightened, his breath catching as the nurse adjusted his pillow, her voice soft. "You're a hero out there." And he nodded, his throat raw, his eyes tracing the ceiling, relief flooding him like a tide, his prototype reclaimed. From the airline's vaults, its blueprints intact, his investor meeting rescheduled, his dream rising from the ashes, the world bending toward justice, a victory he'd bled for, fought for, nearly died for. His hands clenching the sheets as he thought it was over, that he'd won, that the nightmare had ended on that roof, that the sniper's bullet was the last gasp of a dying foe. His resolve, hardening with every beep, every breath, a promise to rebuild, to rise, to honor Marla's sacrifice, Eli's fight, the teenage girl's video, every soul who'd stood with him. Then the nurse leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, her eyes darting to the door. They missed one, and Jamal's heart lurched, his head snapping toward her, his mind racing as she slipped a folded note into his hand. Its edges, worn, its ink smudged, a scrawl from Rick, Karen's brother, free on bail, his words a venomous vow. "You're dead. This ain't finished." A bomb ticking in the silence, a shadow creeping back from the abyss, his freedom a mirage shattered by a final twist, his victory hollowed by a threat he couldn't see. The nurse stepping back, her face pale, her lips sealed as she vanished into the hall, leaving him alone with the note, the machines, the storm. Days later, a blast shook the city, a fireball blooming where Jamal's makeshift lab once stood, its windows shattering, its walls collapsing, Rick's revenge a thunderclap that echoed through the streets, the news screaming sabotage, the donations, torched, the prototype's blueprints safe in Jamal's hospital safe. A bitter lifeline he clutched as he sat up, his bandages straining, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't died, his voice a low growl breaking the silence. "This fight's just begun," a vow whispered to the rain, to Marla, to himself, his hands steady as he unfolded the blueprints, his mind racing with plans, his body weak but his will unbreakable, the courtroom a memory, the convictions a stepping stone, the millions a spark, Rick a shadow he'd hunt, the sniper a ghost he'd unmask, the world watching as he rose again, telling himself it wasn't over, that justice was a war, not a battle, that he'd rebuild bigger, stronger, fiercer, his breath a promise, his heartbeat a drum, his eyes locked on the horizon beyond the glass, a future he'd seize with bloodied hands. He was wrong to think it ended here. The reversal was a beginning, not an end, and the storm raged on, a mirror to the chaos within, the hospital a fortress, the city a battlefield, his fight a flame that wouldn't fade, not now, not ever, the rain washing away the past but not the fire, his story a roar that would echo long after the machines fell silent, a revolution sparked by a man who wouldn't break. The note, a challenge he'd meet head on, the world waiting, breathless, for what came next. Jamal Carter's harrowing journey in this story reveals profound lessons about resilience, systemic injustice, and the power of truth. First, it underscores the unyielding strength required to face relentless racial prejudice. Jamal endured harassment, violence, and betrayal. Yet his determination to protect his solar battery prototype and expose his tormentors never wavered, teaching us that inner resolve can outlast even the darkest storms. Second, the tale exposes the insidious layers of systemic racism, from Karen's initial bias on the flight to Rick's brutal abuse of power and Victor's corporate greed, showing how prejudice festers across institutions, often cloaked as protocol or profit. It's a stark reminder that fighting injustice means confronting not just individuals, but entire systems rigged against the marginalized. Third, the story highlights the double-edged sword of public perception. Protests fueled Jamal's cause, yet media lies nearly destroyed him, proving that truth must be fiercely defended in a world quick to judge. Marla's sacrifice and the teenage girl's video illustrate the vital role of allies and evidence in tipping the scales, urging us to stand up and speak out when we witness wrong. Finally, Rick's final act of vengeance teaches that victory is never absolute. Justice is a marathon, not a sprint, demanding vigilance even after the battle seems won. Jamal's vow to rebuild despite the odds inspires us to rise again, no matter how many times we're knocked down. So, what's your takeaway? Have you ever faced a fight where the odds seemed stacked against you? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit like if Jamal's grit moved you. Subscribe for more tales of courage and share to spark a conversation about standing tall. Thanks for joining this wild ride. Here's to chasing justice and building a world where every voice shines unbroken and bold.